The political structure of ancient Egypt placed the pharaoh at the center of both divine and administrative authority, yet the position of a queen, whether as great royal wife or secondary consort, remained deeply contingent on proximity to that power. Historical records indicate that while queens could wield significant influence, their security was never guaranteed. Their fortunes rose and fell not only with royal favor, but also with shifting alliances, succession anxieties, and the silent calculations of court officials. Surviving inscriptions and reliefs suggest that queens were integral to the symbolic stability of kingship. The title Great Royal Wife was not merely ceremonial. It often signified participation in religious rites, estate management, and dynastic continuity. However, the same records reveal a pattern of abrupt disappearance. Names erased from monuments, images chiseled away, and titles reassigned point toward a recurring phenomenon. Queens who fell from favor were not simply dismissed, they were systematically removed from the historical record. Contemporary accounts from the Old and Middle Kingdoms remain sparse, but archaeological evidence provides insight into how these removals occurred. Tombs left unfinished, burial goods reassigned, and funerary inscriptions altered suggest administrative intervention rather than natural death or gradual decline. In some cases, queens who once held prominent positions were omitted entirely from king lists and temple inscriptions, indicating an intentional act of erasure. The mechanisms behind such removals were closely tied to the structure of royal succession. Egyptian kingship relied on both lineage and perceived divine legitimacy. Queens, particularly those who bore heirs, played a central role in this system. Yet this centrality also made them vulnerable. If a queen's son fell out of favor, or if another lineage gained prominence, her position could rapidly deteriorate. Legal documents from later periods suggest that property rights and titles associated with queens could be reassigned with relative speed, reflecting a bureaucratic system capable of enforcing political decisions without public explanation. Chroniclers noted that the royal court functioned as a highly controlled environment, where access to the king was mediated by officials whose loyalty was often divided among competing factions. In such a setting, queens were both participants in and subjects of political maneuvering. Their influence depended not only on their relationship with the king, but also on their ability to maintain alliances within the court. When those alliances shifted, the consequences could be immediate and severe. One of the clearest patterns observable in the archaeological record is the practice of damnatio memoriae, the deliberate destruction of a person's memory. While more commonly associated with later empires, evidence from Egypt indicates similar practices. Reliefs were recarved, cartouches replaced, and statues reattributed. In the case of queens, this often meant that their contributions to state rituals and building projects were reassigned to successors. Surviving documents suggest that this process was not merely symbolic. It had practical implications for inheritance, land ownership, and the distribution of temple revenues. The lived reality for queens within the palace complex was shaped by both privilege and constraint. Palace records, though fragmentary, indicate a structured environment with designated quarters, attendants, and administrative oversight. Queens managed estates, supervised textile production, and participated in religious ceremonies, yet their movements and communications were likely monitored. The same system that elevated them also ensured that their actions remained visible to those in power. When a queen fell from favor, the transition appears to have been managed through administrative channels rather than public spectacle. There is little evidence of open trials or formal accusations in most cases. Instead, the record suggests a quieter process. Titles ceased to appear, inscriptions stopped, and new names replaced old ones. This absence of explicit documentation has led historians to rely on patterns of omission and alteration to reconstruct these events. In some instances, the removal of a queen coincided with broader political changes. Periods of instability, such as transitions between dynasties or shifts in religious policy, often saw increased evidence of erased figures. This suggests that queens could become casualties of larger structural transformations, their individual circumstances subsumed within the needs of state consolidation. Legal codes of the period reveal that royal women could hold significant economic power, including ownership of land and control over labor forces. The reassignment of these assets following a queen's fall from favor indicates that their removal was not only a political act, but also an economic one. Estates associated with a disgraced queen were often transferred to another royal figure or absorbed into temple holdings, reinforcing the central authority of the state. The emotional dimension of these events remains largely inaccessible due to the nature of the sources. Egyptian inscriptions were designed to project order and continuity, not personal conflict or dissent. As a result, the experiences of queens who lost their status must be inferred indirectly. The abrupt cessation of their presence in official records suggests a rupture, but the specifics of their circumstances, whether confinement, exile, or execution, are rarely documented in explicit terms. Nevertheless, the consistency of the pattern indicates that such outcomes were an accepted part of the political system. The removal of a queen did not disrupt the broader narrative of stability presented by the state. Instead, it was absorbed into that narrative through the careful management of memory and representation. By eliminating references to a fallen queen, the administration effectively rewrote the past to align with the present configuration of power. Archaeological discoveries continue to shed light on these processes. Tomb sites that show signs of modification, inscriptions that reveal multiple layers of carving, and artifacts that have been repurposed all contribute to an understanding of how systematically these removals were carried out. In some cases, the original identity of a queen can only be reconstructed through minute traces, faint outlines of erased hieroglyphs, or inconsistencies in artistic style. These findings suggest that the fate of queens who fell from favor was not an anomaly, but a recurring feature of the political landscape. Their stories, though largely absent from official records, are preserved in the material evidence of alteration and omission. Through these traces, a more complex picture emerges, one in which power was maintained not only through construction and display, but also through controlled disappearance. The administrative sophistication required to carry out such erasures points to a highly organized state apparatus. Scribes, artisans, and officials would have been involved in the process, each contributing to the reconfiguration of the historical record. This collective effort underscores the importance placed on maintaining a coherent narrative of authority, even at the cost of individual recognition. In examining these patterns, it becomes evident that the position of a queen in ancient Egypt was inherently unstable. While some achieved lasting prominence, others were subject to forces that could rapidly and decisively alter their standing. The surviving evidence does not provide a complete account of their experiences, but it does reveal the mechanisms by which they were removed and the broader system that enabled such actions. As more sites are excavated and analyzed, the fragments of these erased lives continue to surface, offering glimpses into a dimension of Egyptian history that was deliberately obscured. The challenge lies in interpreting these fragments without imposing narratives that the evidence cannot support, maintaining a balance between reconstruction and restraint. The pattern of erasure becomes more distinct when examined alongside specific reigns, in which the visibility of royal women shifts abruptly within the archaeological record. Surviving documents suggest that these shifts were rarely accidental. Instead, they appear aligned with changes in succession, religious emphasis, or the consolidation of authority by a new ruler. In these moments, queens who had once been central to the symbolic and administrative life of the court could be rendered absent with notable precision. One of the most frequently cited examples is Hatshepsut, whose case provides insight into the mechanisms used to reshape royal memory. Although she ruled as pharaoh rather than consort, her later treatment reflects processes that also affected queens who fell from favor. Reliefs and statues bearing her image were systematically altered during the reign of Thutmose III, with her cartouches replaced or removed. Historical records indicate that this campaign of erasure was carried out decades after her death, suggesting a calculated decision rather than immediate retaliation. The delay implies that political stability may have initially depended on preserving her legacy, only later allowing for its removal once succession was secure. A similar pattern of controlled disappearance can be observed in the case of Nefertiti, whose prominence during the reign of Akhenaten is well documented. Contemporary inscriptions and artistic representations depict her in positions of unusual authority, sometimes participating in rituals typically reserved for the king. However, surviving evidence indicates that her presence in official records diminishes sharply toward the later years of Akhenaten's rule. Scholars have proposed multiple interpretations, ranging from death to a change in status or identity, but the absence of definitive documentation underscores the limitations imposed by the controlled nature of royal records. The broader context of the Amarna period reveals how shifts in religious policy could intersect with the fate of royal women. Akhenaten's emphasis on the worship of the Aten disrupted established temple networks and redistributed economic resources. Legal codes of the period suggest that temple estates and associated personnel were reassigned under centralized control, altering the balance of power within the court. In this environment, queens associated with previous religious structures or rival factions may have found their positions increasingly precarious. The disappearance of certain figures from inscriptions during this time aligns with a broader pattern of ideological consolidation. Another figure whose historical footprint reflects both prominence and ambiguity is Enkhesenamen, the wife of Tutankhamun. Surviving correspondence, including a letter to the Hittite king, suggests that she faced a period of uncertainty following her husband's death. In this letter, she reportedly requested a foreign prince as a husband, indicating both the absence of a clear successor and her own vulnerable position within the court. Contemporary accounts describe the subsequent death of the Hittite prince en route to Egypt, an event that further complicates the historical narrative. After this episode, Enkhesenamen largely disappears from the record, her ultimate fate undocumented. The administrative response to such situations appears to have been guided by the need to maintain continuity. When a queen's position became politically inconvenient, the state apparatus acted to minimize disruption by reallocating her titles and responsibilities. Inscriptions would be updated, reliefs modified, and new figures introduced to occupy the symbolic space she once held. This process ensured that the visual and textual representation of authority remained consistent, even as the underlying reality shifted. Evidence from tomb construction provides additional insight into these transitions. In several cases, tombs originally intended for queens were left incomplete or repurposed. The reassignment of burial spaces suggests a practical dimension to the process of erasure, extending beyond symbolic representation to the management of physical resources. Archaeological surveys have identified instances where burial goods were reused or redistributed, indicating that the removal of a queen from favor could have material consequences for her intended commemoration. The case of Tai offers a contrasting perspective, highlighting the conditions under which a queen's influence could endure. Tai's prominence is well attested through inscriptions, statues, and diplomatic correspondence. Even after the death of her husband, she appears to have retained a degree of authority, as evidenced by her continued depiction in official contexts. However, this endurance may have been contingent on the stability of the succession and her established network of alliances. Her example underscores the variability of outcomes for queens within the same institutional framework. Chroniclers noted that the court's internal dynamics were shaped by a combination of familial relationships and administrative hierarchies. Queens who lacked strong support among influential officials or who were associated with unsuccessful political factions faced greater risk. The absence of explicit accusations in the surviving record suggests that formal charges were not always necessary. The withdrawal of recognition itself functioned as a decisive act. The role of scribes and artisans in this process cannot be overlooked. Surviving documents indicate that these individuals were responsible for implementing the changes dictated by the administration. The precision with which names and images were altered points to a coordinated effort, likely overseen by high-ranking officials. This level of organization reflects the importance placed on controlling the narrative of kingship and ensuring that it aligned with current political realities. In examining these cases, it becomes clear that the fate of queens who fell from favor was closely tied to broader structural factors. Succession disputes, transformations, and shifts in administrative control all contributed to an environment in which the position of a queen could change rapidly. The lack of detailed personal accounts limits the ability to reconstruct individual experiences, but the patterns observed across multiple reigns provide a framework for understanding the mechanisms at work. Surviving documents suggest that the removal of a queen was rarely an isolated event. It often coincided with the elevation of another figure, whether a new consort, a royal relative, or a political ally. This replacement process reinforced the continuity of the institution while simultaneously obscuring the transition. By presenting a seamless narrative, the state minimized the perception of instability and maintained the legitimacy of the ruling authority. The long-term effects of these practices are evident in the challenges faced by modern historians. The deliberate alteration and omission of records have created gaps that can only be partially filled through archaeological investigation. Each discovery, whether a fragment of an inscription or a reattributed artifact, adds to the understanding of how these processes operated, but also highlights the extent to which the historical record was shaped by those in power. As research continues, the accumulation of evidence allows for a more nuanced interpretation of these events. Rather than viewing the disappearance of queens as anomalies, it becomes possible to see them as integral to the functioning of the political system. Their removal, while often silent in the written record, was a deliberate act embedded within the broader strategies of governance and control. The consistency of these patterns across different periods suggests that the mechanisms of erasure were not improvised responses, but established practices. They reflect a system in which authority was maintained not only through visible displays of power, but also through the careful management of absence. In this context, the fate of queens who fell from favor can be understood as part of a larger process by which the state defined and redefined its own history. The cumulative effect of these practices becomes most apparent when examining the long-term construction of historical memory in ancient Egypt. What survives in temple walls, royal lists, and funerary monuments is not a complete record, but a curated one. Historical records indicate that this curation was not incidental. It was an extension of governance itself. The removal of queens from official narratives did not merely reflect political change. It actively shaped how continuity and legitimacy were perceived across generations. King lists compiled in later periods illustrate this process with particular clarity. These records, intended to establish an unbroken line of rulers, often omit figures whose reigns or associations were deemed problematic. While queens rarely appear in such lists, their absence is nonetheless instructive. Surviving documents suggest that when a queen's influence conflicted with the narrative of stable succession, her presence could be minimized or erased entirely. This absence extended beyond her own identity, often affecting the recognition of her offspring and, by extension, their claims to legitimacy. The relationship between queenship and succession remained one of the most critical points of vulnerability. Legal codes of the period reveal that inheritance, both symbolic and material, depended heavily on recognized lineage. A queen who lost favor risked not only her own position, but also the standing of her children. Inscriptions that once identified a prince through his mother could be altered or replaced, effectively redefining his place within the dynastic hierarchy. This suggests that the erasure of a queen could have far-reaching consequences, influencing the political landscape well beyond her lifetime. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reinforces this interpretation. Tombs associated with certain royal women show signs of modification that extend into subsequent reigns. Names overwritten, titles removed, and iconography adjusted indicate that the process of erasure did not always end with the queen's initial fall from favor. Instead, it could continue as later administrations revisited the past to align it with contemporary needs. This ongoing revision underscores the dynamic nature of historical memory within the Egyptian state. The role of religious institutions in this process also appears significant. Temples functioned not only as centers of worship, but as repositories of economic and political power. Queens often held titles linked to specific deities or temple estates, granting them influence within these networks. When a queen was removed, surviving documents suggest that her religious roles were reassigned, along with the resources attached to them. This redistribution reinforced the authority of the ruling administration while ensuring that temple operations continued without interruption. Chroniclers noted that the visual language of Egyptian art played a crucial role in maintaining this continuity. Reliefs and statues were not merely decorative. They conveyed the ideological framework of kingship. When a queen's image was altered or removed, it was replaced with one that supported the current narrative. The precision of these alterations indicates a high level of coordination between artistic and administrative functions. Each modification contributed to a coherent representation of authority, even as the underlying reality shifted. The absence of explicit accounts describing the personal experiences of these queens remains a defining limitation. Egyptian sources prioritized order and permanence, leaving little room for the documentation of conflict or dissent. As a result, the emotional and psychological dimensions of falling from favor are largely inaccessible. However, the consistency of administrative responses suggests that such outcomes were anticipated within the system. The structures of governance were designed not only to elevate individuals, but also to remove them with minimal disruption. Comparative analysis with other ancient societies indicates that this approach was not unique, but the scale and consistency observed in Egypt are notable. The integration of political, religious, and economic systems allowed for a level of control over historical narrative that few contemporaneous states could achieve. This integration meant that the fate of a queen was not determined solely by personal relationships, but by her position within a complex network of institutional dependencies. One of the enduring challenges in studying these figures lies in distinguishing between absence due to erasure and absence due to limited documentation. Surviving evidence suggests that both factors are at play, but the patterns of alteration, particularly in well-preserved sites, strongly support the conclusion that deliberate removal was a common practice. Advances in archaeological techniques, including digital imaging and material analysis, have made it possible to detect traces of erased inscriptions that were previously invisible. These discoveries continue to refine the understanding of how extensively these practices were employed. The case studies examined across different dynasties reveal both variation and consistency. Some queens, like Tai, retained influence beyond the typical boundaries of their role, suggesting that strong political alliances and stable succession could mitigate the risks inherent in their position. Others, such as Nefertiti or Ankhesenamun, illustrate how quickly prominence could give way to obscurity when those conditions changed. The differences between these outcomes highlight the importance of context, while the similarities point to an underlying system that governed them all. The long-term effects of these practices extend into modern interpretations of Egyptian history. The gaps created by deliberate erasure have shaped the questions historians ask and the methods they use to answer them. Each reconstructed narrative must account for the possibility that what is missing was intentionally removed. This awareness has led to a more cautious and analytical approach, emphasizing the need to corroborate evidence across multiple sources and disciplines. Surviving documents suggest that the state's ability to control its own history was both a strength and a limitation. While it allowed for the maintenance of a stable and coherent narrative, it also obscured the complexities and conflicts that inevitably arose within such a system. The fate of queens who fell from favor serves as a reminder of this duality. Their absence from the record is itself a form of evidence, pointing to processes that were essential to the functioning of them but remain only partially visible. In considering these patterns, it becomes clear that the position of a queen in ancient Egypt cannot be understood solely through her periods of prominence. Equal attention must be given to the mechanisms that could remove her from view. The interplay between visibility and absence, recognition and erasure, reflects a broader strategy of governance in which control over the past was inseparable from control over the present. As archaeological and textual research continues, the outlines of these erased lives become incrementally clearer. Each fragment recovered, whether a partially preserved cartouche or a reinterpreted burial context, adds to a growing body of evidence that challenges earlier assumptions. The process is gradual and often inconclusive, but it underscores the resilience of historical inquiry in the face of deliberate omission. The documented fate of queens who fell from favor, therefore, is not defined by a single outcome, but by a set of recurring practices. These practices reveal a system in which power was maintained through both presence and absence, where the authority of the state depended as much on what was remembered as on what was forgotten.